Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants. Immigrants. Chinese.
Chinese immigrants. Immigrants. Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. 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 Chinese Supreme Court. Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants. Supreme Court. Chinese Supreme Court. Chinese immigrants. Supreme Court. States. Chinese United States. San Francisco. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. San Francisco. United States. Chinese immigrants. San Francisco. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. United States. Chinese United States. Horse. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Chinese immigrants. Court. United States. Chinese immigrants. United States. Chinese immigrants. San Francisco. Chinese immigrants. San Francisco Supreme Court. San Francisco. Chinese immigrants. Supreme Court. Chinese immigrants. Chinese Supreme Court. States. Chinese Supreme Court. Chinese immigrants. Supreme Court. States. Court. San Francisco Supreme Court. San Francisco. Chinese immigrants. Supreme Court. Chinese Supreme Court. San Francisco. Chinese immigrants. Court. Chinese immigrants. United States. Chinese immigrants. Chinese United States. Court. Chinese immigrants. San Francisco. United States. Chinese Supreme Court.